The studio lights burned hot, casting a sterile glow across the debate stage. Millions of viewers tuned in, waiting for yet another shouting match between a political insider and a rising congresswoman. Kash Patel leaned forward in his chair, his voice slick with confidence, his words sharpened like daggers. He smirked as if the cameras belonged to him, as if the stage were built for his authority alone. Each sentence dripped with condescension, a reminder of his years basking in power, of his certainty that intimidation could bend anyone to his will. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Patel's tone wasn't just dismissive. It was designed to humiliate. He cut Jasmine Crockett off mid-sentence, wagging his finger, calling her uninformed, calling her emotional, as if her perspective didn't belong in the conversation. The air felt heavier with each jab, the tension stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. A few in the crowd chuckled nervously, unsure whether they were allowed to laugh. Patel thrived on that hesitation, his grin widening as if he had already won. But then, silence. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back, folded her arms, and let the arrogance roll past her like smoke against glass. Her eyes locked on Patel's, calm and steady, the kind of gaze that strips pretense away. For a second, even the moderator froze, sensing something electric building in the room. Then she spoke. Her voice was measured, deliberate, the kind of tone that slices deeper than a shout. If arrogance were experience, you might actually have a point. But what you're confusing as strength is nothing more than recycled talking points. And America's tired of men, like you mistaking volume for vision. The words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted. Laughter, applause, gasps colliding into a single roar that rolled across the studio. Patel blinked hard, his smirk cracking, the mask of confidence faltering in real time. For the first time all night, he was. But the real story wasn't just this one line. It was the build-up, the backstory, and the shockwaves that followed. This wasn't just another television debate. It came at a moment when America was wrestling with questions far deeper than policy details. The air outside the studio was thick with cultural battles. Immigration reform, racial justice, the role of truth in politics. Every word spoken on that stage was more than commentary. It was a weapon in a larger war over the country's identity. Viewers didn't just tune in for information. They tuned in to see who could carry their hopes and who would expose their flaws. Kash Patel entered the studio with the confidence of someone who had long operated within the corridors of power. To him, this was just another opportunity to project dominance, to bulldoze through an opponent with a mix of bravado and insider swagger. His reputation was built on it. Speak loudly, act decisively, never admit weakness. For Patel, the stakes were personal. If he could embarrass Crockett, he could reinforce his image as a relentless operator, a man still relevant in the post-Trump orbit. Every soundbite he delivered was meant to remind the audience that he was untouchable. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman carrying something far more resonant. She wasn't just there to argue facts. She was there to represent millions who had grown weary of being dismissed, diminished, and underestimated. Her rise had been steady, fueled not by bluster, but by clarity and grit. For her, this debate wasn't about winning points. It was about showing that dignity could stand toe-to-toe with arrogance and win. The atmosphere of the country demanded it. People were exhausted by the endless noise of talking heads who treated politics like performance. They longed for someone who could cut through the chaos and remind them what integrity looked like under pressure. Crockett knew this, and she carried that burden with quiet resolve. Patel on the other. But in doing so, Patel revealed his blind spot. He underestimated not just Crockett, but the audience's appetite for authenticity. The more he flexed, the more he sneered, the more he looked like a caricature of the very establishment arrogance people had grown tired of. And in contrast, Crockett's restraint wasn't silence. It was strategy. She understood that timing mattered more than volume, that truth carried weight when spoken at the precise breaking point. This clash wasn't about two individuals sparring. It symbolized a larger battle being fought in American politics. The fight between those who cling to old hierarchies of power and those who demand respect for every identity, every community, every story that has too often been erased. Patel carried the banner of dismissal, of gatekeeping, of control. Crockett carried the banner of resistance, dignity, and truth. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Millions of Americans tuned in not just to see who could win a debate, but to see if someone could finally puncture the arrogance that had dominated their screens for years. Crockett represented more than herself. She represented the possibility that a new kind of politics could break through, one built on substance and respect rather than swagger and insult. To understand the weight of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, you first have to understand who Kash Patel was when he stepped onto that stage. He wasn't just another commentator with sharp elbows. He was a product of the Trump machine, molded in its image, carrying the scars and swagger of someone who had risen through chaos and controversy. In the eyes of his supporters, he was brash, unapologetic, and loyal to the end. In the eyes of his critics, he was everything wrong with politics: arrogant, opportunistic, and more interested in spectacle than substance. Patel built his persona in the crucible of Washington power. A lawyer by training, he made his name not by practicing quiet diligence, but by embracing combat. He became known as a relentless operator, someone willing to bulldoze institutions in the service of political objectives. That reputation hardened during his time under the Trump administration, where he held high-profile roles connected to intelligence and national security. To his allies, Patel was a warrior, unyielding, fearless, and willing to challenge the so-called deep state. To others, he was reckless, dismissive of norms, and intoxicated by proximity to power. But what truly defined Patel wasn't just his resume, it was his attitude. He exuded the kind of confidence that made headlines, a belief that rules and decorum were for other people. When confronted with criticism, he didn't apologize or explain, he doubled down. When challenged in interviews, he didn't debate with nuance. He attacked, often leaving opponents flustered and defensive. Television producers loved booking him because he brought fireworks. He played the villain with such conviction that it didn't matter whether he was factually right. What mattered was that he looked unshakable on camera. Over time, though, the cracks began to show. Patel's name surfaced in connection with controversies that painted a more complicated picture. Accusations of partisanship in intelligence briefings. Public statements that contradicted established facts. Grandiose claims that blurred the line between truth and spin. To his critics, he became the embodiment of a Washington insider who cloaked himself in outsider language, a man who thundered about draining the swamp while thriving in its murky waters. Still, his confidence never wavered. If anything, each scandal seemed to embolden him further. That arrogance became a weapon in debates. Patel carried himself with the swagger of someone convinced he could out-talk, out-shout, and outmaneuver anyone. Yet beneath that persona lurked contradictions. He presented himself as a truth-teller exposing corruption, yet critics accused him of manipulating facts to serve political agendas. He claimed to speak for the people, yet often aligned himself with the very elites he pretended to scorn. He painted himself as fearless, yet his bravado looked more like bluster to those who saw through the act. These contradictions didn't matter in arenas where dominance was rewarded over depth. But on a live stage with someone like Jasmine Crockett, they would come back to haunt him. Patel walked into that studio confident, even smug. He believed this was just another debate where his sheer force of personality would overwhelm. After all, it had worked before. He had stared down interviewers, shut down fellow panelists, and turned countless discussions into showcases of his own bravado. Why would this be any different? But here lay the fatal miscalculation. Patel didn't realize the country had grown weary of arrogance dressed up as leadership. He didn't realize that Crockett wasn't the type to be rattled by insults or cowed by bravado. To him, she was just another opponent to swat aside, another chance to perform dominance for the cameras. In reality, she was the mirror reflecting back everything the public had grown to despise about him. The tragedy of Patel's performance was that he couldn't see the impending downfall even as it unfolded. He mistook laughter in the crowd as validation, mistook his smirk as unshakable armor. He couldn't grasp that the very traits that once made him formidable, his brashness, his unwillingness to concede, were now the very traits making him vulnerable. For years, Kash Patel had strutted across political stages like a man untouchable, basking in the power of his inflated ego. But ego is fragile, and arrogance has a way of crumbling the moment it meets unshakable truth. On that night, before millions of viewers, his greatest strength became the very weak. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin under the bright studio lights or in the polished halls of power. It begins in the quiet corners of a world that rarely rolls out red carpets for women like her. She wasn't born into privilege. She didn't inherit connections. She didn't have the safety net of elite networks smoothing her path. What she had instead was grit, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind born of fighting uphill battles, the kind that teaches you early that respect is never handed out freely. It has to be earned. She grew up watching how the world treated people who looked like her, people who carried names and histories dismissed by those in power. Instead of breaking her down, that reality lit a fire. It gave her urgency. It gave her voice. From a young age, Jasmine learned how to navigate a society that often tried to silence her. And in that struggle, she sharpened tools that would one day cut through arrogance on national television. Her education wasn't just textbooks and lectures. It was survival, learning how to read people, how to pick her moments, how to strike with precision when others underestimated her. In classrooms, she was often overlooked. In debates, she was often ignored. But those experiences didn't shrink her, they forged her. The more she was underestimated, the more she learned to prepare. The more she was dismissed, the more she built resilience. By the time she stepped into the political arena, she had mastered the art of turning invisibility into advantage. Jasmine's rise in politics wasn't meteoric, it was deliberate. Every step came with resistance. Opponents rolled their eyes. Commentators called her too young, too fiery, too raw. But what they failed to understand was that her sharpness wasn't recklessness. It was focus. Her wit wasn't impulsive. It was honed from years of having to defend her dignity against a world too eager to write her off. Her calmness wasn't naivety. It was strategy, the patience of someone who knew that arrogance always reveals its own weakness if you give it enough room. She entered public service not to be famous, but to be a shield for those who had none. Communities dismissed by lawmakers saw in her a reflection of themselves, someone willing to carry their stories, their pain, their hopes, into rooms where they were too often ignored. She spoke for the people who worked the hardest, yet were respected the least, for those whose identities were mocked or erased, for those who had grown tired of politicians who used them as props instead of partners. And while Patel thrived in rooms where dominance was measured in how loudly one could shout, Jasmine thrived in the quiet, studying, preparing, sharpening arguments. Where he leaned on arrogance, she leaned on truth. Where he relied on swagger, she relied on substance. And when the time came to speak, her words carried not just her own conviction, but the weight of every community she represented. It was that duality, the humility of her roots combined with the sharpness of her rise, that made her dangerous to someone like Patel. He couldn't see it. To him, Crockett looked like another opponent to crush, another stepping stone in his theater of dominance. But what he didn't understand was that her calm wasn't weakness, it was confidence. Her pauses weren't hesitation, they were calculation. Her poise wasn't luck, it was the product of years of surviving in rooms where she was told she didn't belong. Those who knew her best often spoke about her wit, the way she could dismantle an argument with one sentence, the way her intelligence didn't scream but sliced. They spoke about her ability to hold her ground without resorting to theatrics, about the quiet authority that made people lean in when she spoke. She was, in many ways, the exact opposite of Patel. Where he puffed himself up, she let truth do the work. Where? And that contrast is what made the clash inevitable. One man convinced his ego could not be broken. One woman who had spent her entire life proving egos wrong. Patel thought he was walking into another easy performance. Jasmine knew she was walking into an ambush, and she came armed with the kind of composure that could turn arrogance into rubble. The brilliance of Crockett's rise wasn't that she shocked people with sudden victories. It was that she chipped away, moment by moment, until even her doubters had to admit she was impossible to ignore. By the time she sat across from Patel under those studio lights, she carried with her not only the strength of her own journey, but the collective resilience of everyone who had been told they weren't enough, everyone who had been dismissed, everyone who had been silenced. And that background is exactly what prepared her for the moment Patel tried to corner her on national TV. The debate stage was set like a battlefield disguised in civility. The polished floor gleamed under studio lights, the moderator's voice crisp as they guided the discussion from topic to topic. Cameras panned across the audience, some leaning forward in anticipation, others clutching their phones, ready to capture a viral moment. The tension in the room wasn't hidden. It vibrated, unspoken but alive. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a polite exchange. This was going to be a showdown. Patel made sure of it. From the opening minutes, his posture screamed condescension. He sat forward with his chin lifted, voice rolling with the confidence of a man who had played this game before. He interrupted Jasmine mid-sentence, each time with a dismissive chuckle or a sharp interjection designed to knock her off balance. "Congresswoman, let's be real here," he sneered, smirking toward the cameras as though inviting the audience to laugh with him. "You might have the passion, but you don't have the experience to understand how the real world works." The words dripped with contempt. Some in the crowd shifted, uncomfortable with the way Patel's tone blurred the line between disagreement and disrespect. But Patel didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. To him, the debate was about control. If he could dominate Crockett with volume, with interruption, with smug certainty, then the narrative would belong to him. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She didn't meet his arrogance with fire. She met it with composure. Her rebuttals were calm, steady, measured. When he cut her off, she waited. When he raised his voice, she lowered hers. Each response she delivered was grounded in facts and clarity, and the more she spoke, the more the contrast sharpened. Patel all bluster, Crockett all substance. The tension grew with every exchange. Patel pushed harder, his tone rising with irritation. He accused her of being soft on reality, of living in a world of feelings instead of facts. His words echoed with the smugness of someone who had grown too comfortable bullying opponents into silence. Yet every time, Crockett absorbed the blows and answered with precision. Her calmness unsettled him. It wasn't what he expected. He had prepared for a shouting match, a sparring partner he could overwhelm with speed and volume. Instead, he found himself shadowboxing against a wall of composure, a silence that magnified his arrogance rather than validating it. And the audience noticed. Each time Crockett answered without flinching, a ripple of approval moved through the crowd. Small nods, subtle murmurs, even a burst of applause the moderator struggled to quiet. Patel's smirk grew tighter, his words faster. He leaned harder into condescension, at one point wagging his finger directly at her. "See, this is the problem," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want to lecture the rest of us with ideals, but you've never been in the trenches. You don't know what real leadership looks like." The jab was meant to humiliate, to reduce her to A. The escalation was no longer just verbal, it was psychological. Patel's attempts to rattle her were unraveling, and the more he pressed, the more desperate he appeared. Crockett, by contrast, radiated control. Every measured response was another reminder that the arrogance across from her was cracking under its own weight. The debate had turned into a slow boil, tension thickening in the air, waiting for the moment when the simmer would spill into something explosive. The audience could feel it. The moderator could feel it. Even Patel, somewhere beneath his bluster, must have sensed that the ground beneath him was shifting. Then Patel overplayed his hand, and Crockett saw her opening. Patel leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie as though he had just sealed the debate. His voice swelled with that familiar tone of certainty, the kind of booming arrogance that he wore like armor. "The truth is simple," he declared, turning toward the audience as if addressing them directly. "Congresswoman Crockett might have passion, but passion doesn't pay the bills. Passion doesn't keep America safe. Passion doesn't win on the world stage. What we need are leaders with grit, with spine, with real-world experience, and not politicians who think sound bites are the same thing as solutions." His words were heavy with smugness, punctuated by a condescending grin he shot in her direction. The audience shifted. Some of Patel's supporters clapped weakly, their enthusiasm undercut by a sense that he was dragging the exchange into cruelty rather than strength. Still, Patel pressed forward, convinced he was driving the final nail. "You can tweet all you want, Congresswoman. You can preach in committees. But at the end of the day, leaders like me carry the weight. Leaders like you just ride the headlines." He expected Crockett to bristle, to stumble, to fire back in anger. That was the formula: provoke, rattle, dominate. Instead, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She didn't even blink. Her silence stretched across the stage, drawing the eyes of the audience. A pause, long, deliberate, unnerving. Patel's smirk flickered, just for a second. He cleared his throat, leaned forward as if to fill the silence. But Crockett raised her hand gently, palm open, and the room hushed again. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You know, Mr. Patel, I've heard a lot of people like you talk about real leadership." She leaned in slightly, her gaze locked on his, her tone unhurried, precise. "But let me ask you this. When did arrogance become a substitute for experience? When did belittling people become the standard of leadership? Because if that's the bar you've set for yourself, America is in much deeper trouble than I thought." The audience erupted in a wave of laughter and applause, a release of the tension that had been suffocating the room. Patel tried to hold his expression steady, but his jaw tightened. Crockett wasn't finished. She pressed on, her words cutting clean, each one sharper than the last. "You sit here bragging about carrying the weight," she continued, her tone never rising, "but what exactly have you carried except the baggage of failed policies and half-truths? You talk about passion like it's a weakness, but passion is what keeps families working 2 jobs to put food on the table. Passion is what keeps immigrants fighting for a country that doesn't always fight for them. Passion is what makes people believe America can be better than what you're selling. If that's not leadership, then maybe the problem isn't passion. Maybe the problem is men like you confusing volume with vision." Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by thunderous applause. The camera lights glared hotter, zooming in on Patel's face as his smirk disintegrated into something. Patel's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. For a man who thrived on controlling the tempo, the silence was devastating. Crockett had stolen not just the spotlight, but the rhythm of the entire debate. And she knew it. Her final line landed with surgical precision. "So for the next time you confuse arrogance for strength, remember this moment. Because strength is not about who talks the loudest. It's about who stands the tallest when others try to tear them down. And tonight, Mr. Patel, you just showed America the difference." The audience exploded. Applause roared like a tidal wave, mixed with cheers and laughter. Some stood from their seats, clapping above their heads. The sound drowned out Patel's attempts to regain control. His mouth moved, but the crowd wasn't listening. They were locked onto Crockett, their faces alight with the recognition that they had just witnessed a moment destined to echo far beyond the studio walls. Crockett sat back, serene, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had. She had delivered the kind of comeback that transcends a debate. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a mic drop, a dismantling of an entire persona. Patel looked smaller under the lights, his earlier bravado collapsing into awkward silence. For years, he had been a man who dominated with interruptions and insults. But now, he was the man who had been undone by a single, devastating moment of clarity. Even the moderator, trained to maintain neutrality, hesitated before moving to the next question. The pause itself told the story. something unforgettable had just unfolded. Clips of the exchange were already being clipped, tweeted, and shared. Smartphones in the audience glowed as people typed furiously, eager to spread the line before the debate had even ended. Crockett's words weren't just answers to Patel. They were ammunition for a nation exhausted by arrogance. Patel's shoulders sagged slightly, his earlier posture of dominance deflating. He attempted to war. For Crockett, it wasn't victory by volume. It was victory by truth delivered at the exact moment when arrogance peaked. She didn't need a shout. She didn't need theatrics. She needed only to reveal Patel for what he was, and let the audience see the difference between noise and leadership. And they did. They saw it in real time, and they responded with the kind of visceral energy that signals a cultural shift. Patel had entered the stage as the presumed heavyweight. He left that moment looking like a man who had just been unmasked. But the real explosion came after the cameras stopped rolling. The clip hit the internet before the debate had even wrapped. Someone in the studio audience uploaded it within seconds. The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, delivered her line, and left Patel staring, wordless, under the glare of studio lights. By the time the moderator was stumbling into the next topic, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram were already ablaze. The hashtag Crockett comeback surged to the top of trending lists nationwide. Memes sprouted like wildfire. Patel's stunned face frozen mid-blink, captioned with lines like, "When you realize the underdog just cooked you on live TV." Another clip looped Crockett's words. "Maybe the problem is men like you confusing volume with vision," synced to booming bass drops, instantly soundtracking videos across TikTok. On Twitter, verified accounts amplified the moment. Journalists framed it as the debate's defining highlight. Late-night comedians quote-tweeted it with quips about the smackdown of the season. Celebrities joined in. A Grammy-winning singer praised Crockett for embodying every woman who's ever been dismissed in a meeting, while a Hollywood actor called it the line that America didn't know it needed. Activists, grassroots, organizers, and ordinary viewers added their voices, celebrating not just the win, but what it represented. Dignity standing tall against arrogance. Meanwhile, Patel's camp scrambled. His allies rushed to spin the exchange, insisting Crockett had been disrespectful, that she had played to the crowd instead of the facts. A conservative commentator on cable news claimed Patel had let her talk herself into a corner. But the spin fell flat. The clip itself told a different story. Patel shrinking under the weight of his own arrogance while Crockett's calm precision stole the spotlight. No amount of talking points could overwrite what millions had already seen with their own eyes. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Patel's supporters clung to excuses, recycling phrases about liberal media bias and manufactured outrage. Crockett's supporters, on the other hand, flooded feeds with celebration. For them, this wasn't just a debate victory. It was validation, a cultural moment. Women of color, immigrants, and young voters especially found themselves rallying around Crockett's poise. They saw in her not just a politician, but a reflection of their own struggles, being talked over, dismissed, belittled, only to rise above with wit and composure. Within hours, the clip reached millions. By morning, it had gone international. News outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa carried headlines about the American lawmaker's viral clapback. Comment sections filled with viewers from across the globe cheering. This is what leadership looks like. Patel's moment of humiliation became a global spectacle, his name trending alongside Crockett's, but always in the shadow of her triumph. Commentators framed the exchange in bigger terms. Political analysts noted that Crockett had done more in 10 seconds to cut through arrogance than hours of prepared speeches ever could. Social media experts dissected why the clip went viral so fast. Timing, relatability, the clean arc of underdog versus bully. Civil rights leaders praised Crockett for embodying the fight against disrespect and erasure. The story wasn't just about her comeback. It was Even politicians weighed in. Allies of Crockett praised her on camera, calling it a masterclass in poise under fire. Rivals, grudgingly, admitted Patel had walked into a buzzsaw. One senator quipped, "That wasn't a debate. It was a political baptism." For Patel, every attempt to reclaim the narrative only made him look smaller, more desperate. His arrogance, once his shield, had become a meme. What made the moment so powerful wasn't only Crockett's words. It was the ripple effect. High school students clipped her lines into motivational edits. Activists put them on placards. TikTok creators remixed them into inspirational reels. Her comeback leapt beyond politics and into culture, becoming shorthand for resilience in the face of arrogance. Patel had gone into the debate aiming to remind America of his dominance. Instead, he had reminded them of why they were tired of dominance in the first place. Crockett, without raising her voice, had shifted the balance. Her dignity became contagious, her composure viral. And just when people thought the storm was over, Crockett turned the moment into something bigger. In the days after the debate, Jasmine Crockett was asked again and again about the moment, the line that ricocheted across the country and made her name a household one. Yet when she spoke, she refused to bask in it as a personal trophy. She didn't gloat, didn't frame it as a victory over Cash Patel. Instead, she leaned into something larger, something more enduring. Her message was clear. This wasn't about her versus him. It wasn't even about winning a single night's exchange. It was about proving that arrogance doesn't get the last word, that respect can still command the stage, and that truth, delivered calmly, firmly, with dignity, has the power to silence even the loudest bully. Crockett reminded people that she hadn't come from privilege or influence. She came from grit, from hard work, from the belief that justice was worth the fight. And when Patel tried to, every underdog told to wait their turn. Her comeback, she explained, was simply the echo of all those voices that too often go unheard. That's why the moment resonated so deeply. People didn't see just Jasmine Crockett. They saw themselves. They saw their struggles condensed into 10 seconds of grace under fire. And they saw a rare thing in politics. Someone standing tall without losing their humanity. Someone who could withstand the storm and still radiate composure. Her words drew a line in the sand, not between left and right, but between dignity and arrogance, between integrity and bullying. It was a reminder that Americanness is not about domination or silencing, but about standing on equal ground, about every voice having its weight, about courage rooted in respect. Commentators who had expected the story to fade realized it was evolving into something else. Teachers played the clip for students as an example of confidence without cruelty. Community leaders invoked it at rallies to show that standing up for oneself didn't require insults or anger, just truth. Crockett's moment had become a parable, retold in living rooms, classrooms, and social media threads, a spark of inspiration in a time when cynicism often felt overwhelming. And the lesson kept circling back to one truth. Arrogance may be loud, but dignity lasts longer. Patel's bluster had dissolved the instant Crockett answered him. But her calm, cutting truth lingered. It lingered in headlines, in conversations, in the minds of millions who felt a little taller, a little braver because of it. For Crockett, this was never just a debate. It was a chance to show what politics should be about. Not self-importance, not spectacle, but service, resilience, and respect. She embodied the idea that America is strongest not when it silences, but when it listens, not when it bullies, but when it uplifts, not when it narrows its circle, but when it widens it to let everyone stand within it. And that's why this wasn't just a debate. It was a defining cultural moment. From the very first moment Cash Patel strutted onto that stage, arrogance was the story. He believed he could dominate the conversation, silence dissent, and carry himself as the unshakable force. For a while, it looked as if his formula, the smirk, the interruptions, the overbearing tone, would once again drown out the voice of anyone who dared oppose him. But then Jasmine Crockett shifted the entire dynamic with a single, unforgettable line. She didn't shout. She didn't descend into his chaos. She rose above it, wielding truth like a scalpel, slicing through his bluster with calm precision. And in that moment, the balance of power flipped. The audience gasped. Social media exploded. America paused, replayed, and shared. What was supposed to be another display of arrogance became a lesson in dignity. Patel's confidence cracked, but Crockett's composure only grew stronger, standing as a testament to what courage in the face of bullying really looks like. This wasn't just politics. This wasn't just television. It was a cultural spark, a reminder that when faced with condescension, we can answer with clarity. When confronted with disrespect, we can respond with dignity. And when arrogance tries to define the stage, it is dignity that truly owns it. If you believe justice belongs to everyone, if you believe integrity outshines arrogance, if you believe in the courage to stand tall even when underestimated, then this is your moment too. Subscribe, share the story, add your voice to the movement that says dignity will always triumph over arrogance. Because in times like these, silence is surrender, and standing together is the only way we move forward. And that's why this wasn't just a debate, it was a turning point.